Good evening and welcome to Capital Connection, where we join the dots to give you the big picture for business in Africa. I'm Godfrey Mutizwa. On tonight's agenda, South Africa is suffering severe disruptions to its power supplies, with 20% of the country without electricity at any one time, and a direct consequence of 9 years of corrupt rule by former President Jacob Zuma's African National Congress administration. But amid the gloom is a ray of light, and that is the discovery of a significant gas-condensate deposit in South Africa's waters, and worth, by some estimates, about $80 billion. And that figure could potentially grow. But fossil fuel comes with baggage, both for the environment and governance. Our analysts will give their views on what is being described in some quarters as, quote, game changer for the country's energy needs. And the Egyptian strongman and President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has assumed the chair of the African Union this week. So what does this year at the helm herald for the continent? We shall ask an African specialist. And we'll also examine the damaging role fake news is playing in Nigeria's forthcoming election. But first, we are joined by CNBC Africa reporter Lubabalo Mashikana, who is following developments of the near collapse of South Africa's power grid. Also, Lubabalo, just how bad is it? I mean, we heard today that technically speaking, Eskom is insolvent.
Well, Godfrey, Eskom is in debt, in deep debt that's close to R500 billion. And we've seen in the recent days that they've implemented load shedding stage 4 and stage 3 today, and which was unexpected after the SONA that was delivered by President Ramaphosa, which we've seen in December that Eskom implemented load shedding, but there was a relief in January up until now. What caused that, we don't know. But so far, it has been blamed on the power stations that have experienced dire pressure, like the Medupi and the Kusile power stations. And now today I am here in the Johannesburg CBD, where we are seeing the COSATU Federation marching for job losses at Eskom, as the president has announced that Eskom will be unbundled into 3 sectors. And now we are seeing behind me here the CEO of Eskom, Pagamani Khatebe, to accept the memorandum of understanding from the workers, who are actually saying that Eskom can be unbundled, but it must not be privatized. And they're also saying no load shedding. Eskom must get its house in order, Godfrey.
But Lubabalo, if I'm understanding you correctly here, so we have got these words that are being bandied around. So there's privatization, there's restructuring, there's unbundling. If I'm to understand COSATU's opposition, COSATU doesn't want Eskom to end up being owned by private investors. Is that correct? That is correct,
Godfrey. COSATU is against the notion of Eskom being a private company and being held in the private sector. They wanted to remain a state-owned entity. They're saying that this is the only solution to Eskom not shedding jobs, which maybe I disagree, and other people will of course disagree with that, because Eskom, as I've stated before, is experiencing a debt of close to R500 billion, which means that Eskom is in a dire state and cannot really afford to run operations, which is why it is resorting to measures like load shedding. And we've heard in the afternoon that Parliament, the portfolio committee in Parliament for Public Enterprises, led by Minister Pravin Gordhan, has ruled that Eskom will indeed receive a bailout in 3 months' time. And of course, we've heard from the CFO of Eskom, Caleb Kasim, that this Eskom system will continue to experience strain until April. So in order for Eskom to actually be in another good state, again, to be in its original state rather, Godfrey, again, it will need to be in a better state to receive another bailout so they can be able to run operations better, because we understand that the Medupi and the Kusile power station are under dire pressure. So COSATU is saying that no privatization for Eskom, it must stay as an SOE, but we are soon to see if that is going to work, and if that obviously is the entire explanation that the president actually wants to see Eskom in.
Thanks to Lubabalo. Now, the Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has been elected chair of the African Union. My colleague Arnold Segawa spoke earlier with advocate and African affairs specialist Tapiwa Diamond Chajga, and he first asked him what can be expected from Fattah al-Sisi's tenure.
First and foremost, we need to address the issue that the leader of the African Union, he only comes on a one-year term. And of course, whatever he needs to come and do, his mandate is determined by his predecessors. So he basically has to go in with a template that has already been given. But obviously has raised very important issues of Africa to say he wants to look at the security factor of mostly the sub-Saharan Africa. Remember, it's from the Northern Africa. Most of the issues affecting the sub-Saharan Africa. So he says he needs to deal with the issues of the insurgents, the issues of the jihadist attacks. But obviously, he has got a different approach on what I thought he would come in and state. He's speaking of identifying the groups and the associations and the people who are backing up the insurgents in Africa, mostly in the sub-Saharan Africa, of which I believe could not be the best way and the best foot forward to deal with security issues in Africa, because we all know who these people are. They've already been identified.
We already know Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab. These are not names that we're hearing for the first time, you know.
Definitely.
Let's talk about the fact that this is actually an army man, you know. Maybe his predecessor too, Paul Kagame, was an army man once upon a time. But Al-Sisi, the way he actually came in with the Brotherhood and Morsi before that, it's quite interesting that he has chosen a military kind of approach.
Yes. Obviously, he's speaking the correct language. He's speaking the language that people want to hear. But if we look at how he's going to do it within a year, I look at it as impossible. Because the insurgents, the insurgents have always been extending, they've been extending their areas of operating. And the African countries are being caught flat-footed. They are not ready. They're just being caught by surprise.
Right. Let's talk about Paul Kagame, his 1 year in power. One thing that actually sticks out here is the Africa Free Trade Area, which is arguably his biggest achievement, if you ask me. Ratification is the next step here.
Correct.
With him out, do you see as many countries ratifying, or is this going to be another Yamoussoukro decision and Malabo declaration?
You know, it's always easy to have the co-founder of a theory, a person who has got a deep drive into doing something, to continue with it. I believe there should be a mechanism where a person like Paul Kagame would be allowed to continue with what he had started. Yeah, because if you look at the issue of Africa to have an African Union, it was an idea of Thabo Mbeki together with the leader Muammar Gaddafi, wanted to have a unified Africa from the African Renaissance. But from his demise, yes, of course, he's got his own atrocities and dark side of him, but after his demise, we have seen the issue of African Renaissance going on the back page. And I don't see the trade and business bloc that Africa has been trying to come and emerge with being carried over in this new tenure.
Another issue that Paul Kagame was very, very pertinent, cardinal to what it always frustrated him, was the fact that the African Union still depends for financing on handouts from the same people they criticize, the European Union, the Americans. Do you get the sense that this is something that is bound to be seen through with Al-Sisi?
The spirit of dependency would always be entrenched in Africa. We have got all the resources that we need. And trust me, if you look at a country like, as small as it is, Zimbabwe, was the breadbasket of Africa.
So you're saying we're beggars?
Yes, we have that inside of us. I believe it defines us. That's the essence that we have had now, to say, we don't want to be self-sufficient. The amount of diamonds which are in DRC, the amount of diamonds which were in Zimbabwe from that open-cast mine were a lot. And that could have sustained the country. 15 billion which went missing could have sustained the country. DRC, Nigeria, these are powerhouses with oil and gold mines. But guess what? We're still begging.
Tapiwa, always good to have you in the studio. Tapiwa Diamond there, just giving us a sense of what the Al-Sisi chairmanship actually will mean for the African Union.
Now, Nigeria's elections will be held this Saturday, the 16th of February. Apart from the usual insults and criticisms between candidates, the pre-election campaigning has been marked by the rapid rise of fake news. Our Capital Connection producers spoke earlier with Arnaud Frogar, the head of the Africa desk for Reporters Without Borders, and first asked him how widespread is the issue of fake news in the election campaign.
First, although it's quite hard to measure it accurately. But from the researchers and the journalists I interviewed so far, the fake news dissemination is reaching an unprecedented level in Nigeria. Disinformation has never been as widely used in Nigeria as in the past few weeks. And second, and maybe it's the most worrying findings of ours, political parties have been highly involved in the process of fake news production and dissemination. One of the researchers I interviewed spoke of fake news factory to designate campaign centers. That tells a lot. It's hard to tell who is behind. What we know for sure is that some of the staff in both political parties are highly involved. For example, you have Muhammadu Buhari, who had said it was the real him at the press conference a few months back, because there were rumors spreading that he was replaced by a clone when he had health problems back when he was in London for a treatment. You have also political supporters using fake rally photos to amplify the support of their candidate. You have one of the political support group of the main opponent in Nigeria who used a fake photo, photoshopped of Donald Trump, US President Donald Trump, showing, endorsing the support for the political opponent in Nigeria, which was fake, obviously. And this was sometimes used by officials within the parties to amplify the spread of this fake news. What we can say for now is that it undermines journalism. Medias have to dedicate a lot of time and resources to fact-checking, to deconstruct fake news, which are spread widely, especially on social media. But while they're doing that, they do not work on topics, interviews, or investigative reports of their choice, and fake news and the necessity to tell how fake they are is setting a growing part of the agenda of medias and journalists. So what we need to do, and what the authorities need to do, is to strengthen journalism. There is a need for protection in the legal framework, for freedom in the editorial independence, for training, and for financial means. Defending and strengthening, fact-check journalism, good journalism, is an essential necessity in the 21st century, and this election in Nigeria is just showing that.
Thanks, Arnaud. Now, coming up after the break, we will take a closer look at South Africa's offshore fossil fuel discovery and what consequences it may have for both the environment and governance in the country, among other things. Welcome back. Now, the economic benefits of fossil fuel production also include the creation of downstream businesses through to the preservation of foreign exchange. But can there be other costs, such as devastating consequences for the environment and a country's system of governance? First, I'm joined in Lagos by Uchenna Minnis. He's the Chief Market Analyst at Eagle Global Markets. Welcome, Uchenna. Thank you for joining us. Now, Nigeria is well acquainted with fossil fuel production. And to be straight, it has been more of a curse than a blessing for the majority of the population. What lessons do you think South Africa can learn from your guys' experiences in the light of this discovery of potential gas and oil finds?
Right. Nigeria's created and put itself and established itself as a behemoth in terms of oil production from the African market sphere. And we've looked to measure our production in that it matches up with the general OPEC stance. And that's we have all the logistics in place as to bringing those production up to optimal level. The recent meetings at the December OPEC and OPEC Plus has reached out to us to actually turn down our production from our normal capacity of about 1.8 million to 1.9 to somewhere around 1.7. So Nigeria's created itself as a stronghold in terms of oil production, and places like South Africa can always look to follow its footstep.
Yeah, though of course when you look back in history, we do know that when you look at the experience of Nigeria and you compare, for instance, with Norway and perhaps other places like the UK, you're still seeing oil not benefiting the large majority of the population. How should we do it different from you guys?
Right. So when you come to well-developed markets like the Qatar and Norway, as you have mentioned, for us, it's just trying to keep the circuit quite tight. And when I mean quite tight, I mean when the productions are being kept and the refined products are also being kept in the system. So every direct revenue from the sale of oil produce and its products are directly invested into the economy of the producing nation, in this case Nigeria. So if South Africa is looking to come on board as to becoming a significant production house, what they can do is they can always just take that lesson from those developed countries as to how they keep production and revenue increment into that closed system for the direct benefit of its populace.
Yeah, and of course, so you talk about the management of revenue from the oil sales, but one of the big contradictions, if you like, is the fact that you have got Nigeria being such a large crude oil producer, and yet the country does not refine its own oil. What were the challenges that prevented Nigeria from being able to do so, and could South Africa perhaps take a leaf out of those?
No, it's as I earlier mentioned, it's just keeping that circle quite close. And if you are a powerhouse in terms of production and you also create a powerhouse in terms of refinement, that keeps the circle quite close. And you have that direct benefit from your state oil revenues back into the country that's been invested into other infrastructural projects. Now, if you think about it, if you get to produce this crude oil in your country but can't refine it and you put it out there, then you have that fluctuation in exchange rate that could affect and create that risk in terms of the quality of the state revenue that comes into play. So there is that chasing in the circle, or in the closed circle, if you get what I mean, whereby we produce this oil products and we get to still have them not entirely refined in our local market sphere.
Yeah. Is there an opportunity to create a sovereign wealth fund? I want to understand why Nigeria hasn't done one.
Well, in creation of sovereign wealth fund, there are a lot of is theoretically it should be something that the country should look into doing almost years back, but we understand there are a lot of politics that comes into play when you're trying to work around these things. And once those logistics are being handled effectively, it should be an entire no-brainer for a sovereign wealth funds to be in place to help keep things in check and maximize efficacy as regards to Nigeria as a production powerhouse.
Absolutely. Many lessons to be learned from Nigeria for South Africa as it potentially looks to try to exploit the benefits of those oil discoveries. Uchenna, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, with the onslaught of man-made climate change and due in large part to the use of fossil fuels, there are those that believe any new fossil discoveries should stay in the ground. In the studio to discuss with me why South Africa should walk away from its fossil fuel find is the senior campaign manager for the environmental lobby group Greenpeace in Africa, that's Melita Steele. Melita, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I imagine you will prepare for a lot of criticism and also for perhaps a lot of unfriending from South Africans who say, at the time when the country is facing power challenges, you're saying another potential source of revenue should be kept in the ground.
So certainly it's not a very popular opinion in some areas of South Africa. But as far as Greenpeace is concerned, the potentially catastrophic threats of climate change outweigh any potential economic benefits. And as you mentioned yourself, international experience shows that the exploration and drilling of oil actually benefits very few people. So we feel like the potential benefits are being overinflated in South Africa.
Before perhaps we discuss the potential benefits and potential challenges in there. I just wanted to ask whether you've done a study potentially on this oil find and been satisfied that net, if the country were to exploit these findings, it would be to the country's disadvantage.
So we are still trying to...
Or is this still a position that has been built over years and what you guys stand for?
So as far as Greenpeace is concerned, we believe that we need an urgent transition away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy. That's our position. In South Africa, almost all of our electricity comes from coal. So we're already a highly polluting country, the most polluting in Africa. And so we believe that we should not be exploring for new fossil fuels. We should be focusing on shifting away from the ones that we already use.
What do you say to those that say the position of saying you can afford to keep this stuff in the ground is built on those who have? Because when you are looking at the situation in Africa where we don't have the lights on, I mean, I'm sure you know the figure, 650 million Africans do not have access to power. And here in South Africa, if you take out our coal plants, there are no lights. Those that argue that you're talking from a position of having versus the need that's there on the ground. What argument would you use for them?
So in fact, the African continent is in a really great position because there is such a need for electricity development, because there's such a need for growth. We can actually leapfrog the dirty development models that have been used.
They will argue.
Renewable energy is the cheapest source of electricity in South Africa at the moment.
We're not going to leave the studio today.
No, so new renewable energy is cheaper than both new coal and new nuclear. So when lobbyists say renewable energy is expensive, they're absolutely not being accurate.
Yeah. Now, let's just talk a little bit deeper about these oil finds. If you were to take the counter argument, which is that we need to exploit these resources because there are other countries that have been able to use the discovery of these fossil fuels to their great advantage. You can cite your Norways. I think you can cite the Nordic countries in general. I mean, I think you can also talk about, to an extent, Russia and maybe other countries as well, such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates. Where would you stand as an argument in respect to the position that you are adopting?
So I think the conversation that you just had about Nigeria is actually quite an enlightening one.
Yeah, some would say that's mismanagement.
And I would say that what is happening in South Africa with Eskom's collapse is a clear indication of corruption and mismanagement. And so even if it were possible that something like this could benefit South Africa, which Greenpeace disputes, I believe that we, in terms of our governance, in terms of our transparency, in terms of our accountability, we would not be able to manage it. So your opposition is built on the pollution aspect of it and the potential mismanagement of it. Is that correct? And so the contribution to climate change. You mentioned about that at the beginning. But last year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a report that said we have 12 years to act to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. 12 years is a very short time, which means that we can't afford to actually be pulling more fossil fuels up. And then you're looking at the risks of an oil spill, which can happen, especially with deep sea oil drilling. And that is not only devastating to marine life, but can also devastate entire fishing communities. So we believe that the risks far outweigh any potential benefits. Thank you, Melita, and that's all for tonight. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. And you can join us again every Monday and Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. Central African Time. Good night.